All right, so we're going to focus on Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois for most of this week. We're going to spend today just trying to understand some of their differences, philosophical differences, for what was best for the African American people. But in order to have that conversation, I think it's important to start with what was going on in the United States. And we need to understand what was the progressive era, or what some people call the progressive movement. Um, what you're looking at here is just a couple pictures which will help us to kind of put the progressive era into perspective. This is the time in America from the 1890s until around the 1920s, where the United States was really concerned with improving the lives of everyday people. Industrialization was a big thing, urbanization. A lot of immigrants are coming to the United States, and there are a lot of big businesses making a lot of money, but many of those businesses were not treating their employees that well. In addition to, a lot of big cities are starting, but really the living conditions are pretty poor. So you've probably learned about the progressive era several times throughout your social studies career, for lack of a better word. One of the big things that came out of the progressive era is that of the ending of child labor, or at least the idea of setting up a 40-hour work week, and having unions that are becoming big. You'll see the picture of the three presidents. Teddy Roosevelt, who was president from like 1901 to essentially 1909, Taft, who came second, and then Woodrow Wilson up through 1920. All three of these guys made significant steps towards social reform. Wilson dealt a lot with banks, making small businesses have more access to resources so they could compete with the big businesses, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, businesses like that. Roosevelt, in addition to, he's very famous for dealing with foreign countries, was all about the conservation of land, making sure that was available. So all of the national parks are actually because of Teddy Roosevelt, this guy here. And finally, Taft, who's in the middle there, was really just what they call a trust buster. He was all about taking away big business and making sure that monopolies were not formed. So there was a lot of progress, because that's why it's called the progressive era, when it comes to everyday people. During that time, too, in 1920, women finally got the right to vote. But one of the things that's often overlooked during this era is African Americans. There's segregation in schools at this time. There's still a huge disenfranchisement of the African American people, meaning they didn't quite have all their rights, especially when it comes to voting and politics. Racism and discrimination obviously is still a thing. Access to quality health care, education, appropriate housing, all of these things are an issue for the African American people. But none of these presidents really did anything to promote that. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, he was all about segregating workforces and places of employment and things like that. So really what had to happen is these two guys came about. I think it's hard to talk about the progressive era without talking about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Both of these guys, although they had different philosophies on what should be done to help out the African American people, both philosophies have their place in American history. We're going to start by looking at Booker T. Washington. You're going to learn a little bit about a particular speech that he made. Many of you have probably already read W.E.B. Du Bois and his Talented Tenth. That will be an assignment this week, so if you've already done that, great. You don't have to do it again. And for those that haven't, it's actually a pretty good read on leadership and how to best help the African American people. Booker T. Washington on the left. When we learned about him more in depth, what's cool about him is he was actually born enslaved. Notice when he was born, versus W.E.B. Du Bois, who was born in Massachusetts from a very different life. Um, and we'll compare those two as we move forward. Now, the one thing that I think is important to understand so that we can get to why Booker T. Washington was doing what he was doing was that most African Americans during Reconstruction were forced, meaning they had no other opportunities, to go into what we call sharecropping. The way that I can explain sharecropping is I'll give you a moment to read the contract on the right, and I'll tell you what to look for. Um, but the picture on the left, what you're looking at is on the left is the same map as on the right, obviously, but on the left is essentially somebody's plantation, where you have the slave quarters, the master's house, etc. Now, 20 years later, you'd have to assume that these families that are living here are, in fact, the people who were formerly enslaved on this plantation, and they're simply doing the same work they were doing before with, I guess, what we can consider a little bit more freedoms. We did have, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments taking place, but essentially, sharecropping is just another name for slavery. I'm going to give you a moment. It's a good idea to hit pause right now. And in hitting pause, I'd like you to take a moment to read the sharecropping contract on the right. And then I'll highlight some things you should be looking for. So hit pause now. So what you probably have noticed, a couple things about this contract is that, number one, there's not much money to be made here in the fact that um, it is essentially doing the same work for for no pay. It does say something about how you can sell some cotton, but you still owe the owner some other stuff. Nothing can be sold from their sharecroppers' crops until my rent is all paid and all amounts they owe me are paid in full. Now, that could be volatile, meaning that could change. Also, the cropper has to furnish their own bagging, their own ties, and their own twine to even sell that cotton. So, what's the price of that? So, essentially, sharecropping is renting land in exchange for getting some of the crops they grow. Up here at the top it says the sharecroppers are to have half of the cotton, corn, peas, pumpkins, and potatoes they grow if the following conditions are complied with, meaning you have to do this, you have to keep up the fence, you got to milk the cows, you have to do all this other stuff. So it would be very easy for the owner of the land to say that that stuff wasn't meant or that wasn't met, and you only get 1/5 or 2/5 or something. So essentially no wealth is being accumulated, and because there was a lack of access to education and jobs and appropriate housing, Reconstruction actually just kind of fell into many African Americans becoming sharecroppers. Now, I think it must be said that many whites were sharecroppers as well, but we can leave that for another time. And the last thing before I get to your essential assignment is because of this sharecropping, Booker T. Washington, knew that many African Americans had been for generations and generations and generations now laborers, for lack of a better term. And he saw an opportunity for many African Americans to become very, I guess, I don't want to use the word useful, but because he emphasizes the idea of cooperation, racial cooperation with whites, he does want them to get paid. He does want them to be educated, but he wants them to also become valuable to the whites and becoming workers. He pushes for this in a speech in 1895 at the International Cotton Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. And there's a very famous speech where it's called the compromise speech, and you're going to listen to some of it, where he basically says, "Cast down your bucket where you are," is the most famous quote from there. And what that means is you don't have to go far to get the resources you need. Um, he's asking African Americans to just stop pushing for rights, accept social segregation, um, and cooperate. You'll make money. You'll make a decent living. Now, when we get to W.E.B. Du Bois, he doesn't like this idea, and he pushes for all the rights right now. And that's really the big fundamental difference between these two guys. So where I'd like you to go now is you're going to go back into the Google Classroom, and I've set up an ed puzzle where you'll see a 5 or 6 minute clip from a video that I found. It's actually a video about historically black colleges and universities. It's worth watching the entire thing for those that are interested. Just ask me, and I'd be happy to let you know where to find it. But watch the ed puzzle. There's 3 open-ended questions I'd like you to do. Once you turn that in, you'll be good for the day. And for tomorrow, what we'll set up is I want you to be able to compare a little bit of the backgrounds of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Wednesday, we'll get to the assignment on the talented 10th. That's it for now. Have a good one.